welcome on a lovely warm evening to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, New South Wales. Our event tonight is being addressed by Dr. Jonathan Symons, who's a member of our council, but much more importantly, a senior lecturer at Macquarie University's School of Social Sciences. He's a widely renowned expert on climate change issues, including engineering solutions, such as low carbon alternatives. But I'm not going to try and talk about climate change. That's his job tonight. Over to
you. Thank you, Ian. I'll begin by acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, whose unceded lands we're meeting on, and to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Last month, a body called the Climate Overshoot Commission released a report about how the international community should respond to the predicament that we currently find ourselves in, which in summary, since the negotiation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, the international community has had a goal of avoiding dangerous anthropocentric interference in the Earth's climate system. And that goal, since the Paris Agreement, has been interpreted as meaning avoiding warming above 2 degrees Celsius and efforts to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees above Celsius. This year so far, global warming so far is on average around 1.2 to 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial average. However, this year, about 1 in 3 days have been above that 1.5 degree limit. And we've had entire months where we have passed 1.5 degrees. So the predicament that we are faced today is that we are at that threshold. The limit that we agreed to treat as dangerous warming, we haven't quite passed over it, but in the words of Glenn Peters, the 1.5 degree bus has left the station and we're not on it. We know what the destination is. We're going to have whole years this decade which are predicted to go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, and within some point in the next decade or so, we will permanently be above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the task that was set to the Climate Overshoot Commission was to ask what package of measures can the international community take to manage this period, to minimise harms during this now inevitable period of overshoot. So I wrote a little piece in the conversation about that, and Ian asked me to come and speak about this and also the path to the Conference of Parties 28 at Dubai coming up at the end of November this year. Now, I confess I follow the Conference of Parties negotiations from the safety of my office at Macquarie University, but I have no deep expertise in it, so I'll just make a couple of observations about how the thing for me that is really interesting about the Climate Overshoot Commission is it's trying to, I think the purpose of the Commission was to try to bring forward some debates with the idea that looking over the horizon a little bit might lead us to do some preparation, that the kinds of dilemmas that we'll be facing in 10 or 20 years' time, perhaps we'll be able to address them better if we've done some preparation for it. So I think it's bringing forward some slightly exotic topics that are not normally within our climate conversation. But I also the Overshoot Commission talks about 4 ideal kinds of responses to climate change. One, as in 4 types of response. One is to cut emissions, to mitigate climate change, and that is where overwhelmingly Australian discussion about climate change is at, and it should be our major focus. Second is adapting to the changing climate. It was only about 2 decades ago that Al Gore said we shouldn't be talking about adaptation. Adaptation was a lazy cop-out. I think from where we are now, it's obvious everyone needs to adapt to a warming climate. And I would argue that although we don't really focus on it, In today's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, the North-South dispute over adaptation, over financing of adaptation and mitigation costs, and over compensation for loss and damages on account of the climate change which is already occurring, these are the major focus of the international negotiations. Now, we never report that because, for lots of reasons. It's less of a focus for Australia, and I'm not critiquing us for focusing on mitigation. Mitigation is priority number one, but I think question number two of how does the international community respond to the injustice that has arisen, where climate change has been caused by the emissions of the industrialised countries, and the primary victims of climate change are the people in the global south who are most vulnerable to extreme weather events, lack public health support, etc. So this dilemma is, I think, at the heart of global climate negotiations. The third kind of response to climate change that the Overshoot Commission talked about was carbon removal policy. Now, carbon removal, and I'm just kind of giving you my headlines here, is popular if we are talking about natural solutions. Everyone likes trees, mangrove restoration, etc. However, where carbon, which was once in mineral form, is stored in organic form, it is highly likely that that storage will not be permanent. So there are worries, which I'll go into some of the details of them, about the permanence of natural solutions. And so there has been some increasing attention, particularly in the United States, and particularly since countries started adopting net zero targets, to industrial, or we could refer to it as inorganic forms of carbon removal. And one of the points that I'll make is that a big gap has emerged between Australian climate policy and US climate policy, where forms of inorganic carbon storage, in particular direct air capture, is a major focus for the Biden administration, but not on the agenda here. It's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it's an observation that I'm making about a gap between Australian policy and international policy. And the fourth topic which the Climate Overshoot Commission addresses is exploring the possibility of reflecting sunlight, of responding, of taking geoengineering measures, solar geoengineering measures, whose goal would be to reflect some of the sun's energy into space in order to minimise the warming that the Earth experiences at any given level of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Once again, a gulf has emerged between Australia and major international partners, where we have failed to explore solar geoengineering's potential implications in Australia, where, for example, in the United States, Congress recently commissioned a major 5-year scientific investigation into the feasibility and cost-benefit advantages of solar geoengineering. These last two topics, I should note, are not really on the COP28 agenda. The two issues that I'd suggest are most significant at COP28 is the global stocktake, assessing how the international community is progressing on its Paris targets, which is a preliminary to the updating of our nationally determined contributions, and secondly, this ongoing contestation over financing and loss and damages for the global south. Now, the critics of the Climate Overshoot, the Climate Overshoot Commission was commissioned by the Paris Peace Forum with the goal of assessing an integrated package of responses to this period of climate overshoot. It brought together a group of world leaders. I thought probably, since we've got a number of distinguished former diplomats in the room, I'd just run through a couple of the regional ones to give a sense. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, was chairing it. Former Indonesian Finance Minister Mohamed Basri was a member. Kim Campbell, Canada's first female Prime Minister. Anna Tate Tong, the former President of Kiribati. The list goes on of the kind of senior international figures that sat on this Overshoot Commission. Now, I think, so the critics of the Overshoot Commission describe it unkindly, I think, but with a shred of accuracy, as doing soft public relations work for the idea of solar geoengineering. And although I think it is accurate that the funders and instigators of this commission wanted to bring forward some of the difficult conversations that I'm going to talk about today, they set themselves a little bit, they brought together a group of figures who are not softies, does that make sense? They got a group of world leaders together and asked them to consider a package of responses with scientific advice. And I don't think the report is a ringing endorsement for solar geoengineering in particular. I think they were deeply cautious about it. But I do think that there's some politics behind the formation of the Climate Overshoot Commission, where the critics are somewhat right about the desire to bring forward these conversations. But what did the Commission argue? First of all, it suggested that rich countries, so mitigation needs to be priority number one, and rich countries need to aim harder, further than net zero. Countries like Australia need to be prioritising net negative emissions in order to create headspace for countries in the global south to prioritise eliminating poverty and continued economic growth over a super rapid move to net zero emissions. So the first argument was that international equity demands that countries such as Australia strive very, very rapidly to reach net zero, not net zero, to reach net negative emissions. Now, from a perspective of justice, I think it's incontrovertible that that's a strong recommendation. For people who believe that talking about carbon removal is a dangerous distraction from mitigation, you can see there's some complicated politics in that move. Next, they looked at adaptation to climate change, and they made a series of recommendations concerning international assistance to finance adaptation measures in the global south that would be led by local communities, arguing that adaptation is only going to make sense if it is initiated locally, owned locally, the kind of lessons that decades of development policy have found that aid measures are most effective when they have local ownership, I guess, are echoed in the argument that it made around adaptation to a changing climate. I'm going to move to because of a limited time, to the two kind of more exotic topics, I guess they are. The third area that the Commission looks at is removing carbon. And it observed the international debate over natural solutions, but natural solutions are ones where there's not a high level of technology involved in drawing down carbon. They have tended to be popular. In Australia, the main form of negative emissions that we finance is soil carbon schemes. This is particularly popular with both sides of politics because payments to farmers are politically advantageous, and there are agricultural productivity co-benefits from the forms of farming that increase the storage of carbon in soils. So the Commission looked at this debate between what it termed organic and inorganic forms of storage, and it worried, as many others have, that many carbon credit schemes, if you catch an aeroplane, you can offset your flight for just a couple of dollars, and that's tends to be at what I would describe the dodgiest end of the spectrum for those kind of. You're probably planting a tree that no one ever looks at, waters again, and whether that tree burns down or not. I'm probably slandering airlines' offset schemes here, but without being specific, there are offset schemes which are very, very low cost, and very, very low cost offset schemes are almost certain to be somewhere between phony and impermanent. Okay. As we've seen in this country with the extreme fires of recent years, if your carbon is stored in trees, in a warming earth, there is a high probability that those trees will burn down. And that goes for the other forms of natural solutions, that organic storage is likely to be impermanent. So the Commission made an argument that I find highly persuasive, so the other reason why people like natural solutions is that they tend to have co-benefits. If you restore a mangrove, it might protect you against high seas. It might cool the local area. So it sequesters some carbon, and it has a variety of other co-benefits. Now, given the impermanence, the likely impermanence, and also the difficulty of accounting for natural solutions, the Commission argued that our decision-making around natural solutions ought to be organised around those co-benefits. Where there is a measure, such as soil carbon, such as some reforestation, which delivers carbon sequestration and obvious community benefits, well then go for it. But as a general rule of thumb, organising your decision-making around those co-benefits is probably a very positive thing to do. Now that echoes learning that I guess the international climate community has experienced, or has gone through over recent decades, where there's been a scheme under the United Nations Framework Convention called REDD+, which is a scheme to incentivise protection of forests, avoidance of deforestation internationally. Now, when this was first proposed, and there was a complicated pathway to it, but Indonesia played a major role in advocating for international mechanisms where heavily forested countries would receive international payments to protect the carbon sequestered in their forests. And you can see how that seemed like a very attractive win-win solution. Protect biodiversity, protect forests, sequester carbon, reduce atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, and it's also a very low cost. If you're just protecting forests or expanding forest cover, that's a very low cost way of drawing down carbon. That should have been a win-win-win. But what we learnt through the experience of REDD+ projects was that when local land is managed on behalf of the kind of global climate concern, it tends to be simultaneously an act of dispossession, where the existing users of that land find that their access to it is restricted by whatever body is administering it, accounting for it, checking that it's preserved on behalf of global climate concern. Now, there's been efforts to reform REDD+, so that there are protections given for traditional land users. But I think that the REDD+ story illustrates a general rule about the politics of organic or natural versus inorganic carbon removal. That often natural solutions are popular at small scale, but, and perhaps I should have mentioned this earlier, the pathways by which, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tries to come up with pathways by which we might now avoid a long period of overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, nearly all of those pathways include between 100 and 1,000 gigatons of carbon removal across the rest of this century. To put that into proportion, it's a little bit more than the current oil extraction industry, as in it's a faster rate, it's a slower rate of carbon removal than the oil industry currently puts carbon into the atmosphere, but it's in the same kind of order of magnitude as the oil extraction industry's carbon output. So if we are avoiding 1.5, people come up with very, there might be alternatives, but the IPCC's models overwhelmingly require gigaton scale of carbon removal. At the moment, the estimates are that our combined global afforestation plans draw down about 2 gigatons of carbon a year, at the same time as deforestation in other places means that land use change is actually a net driver of greenhouse gas emissions. So scaling up carbon removal to get to that 100 to 1,000 gigaton across the century goal is very likely an impossible enterprise, but it's certainly an incredibly challenging enterprise. And my suspicion is that as you scale natural solutions, political resistance to them rises. If you take what was agricultural land and you afforest it, then the kinds of communities that were the businesses that were operating in that land, you need a lot lower human labour in managing forests that are sequestering carbon than you do in other agricultural industries. So we've already seen in this country political opposition to forests at fairly low scales. If you were trying to get to that multiple gigaton scale of carbon removal with natural solutions, then there's going to be all kinds of forms of dispossession and of political opposition emerge to that. Direct air capture is the leading example of an inorganic solution. The Biden administration, to give you a sense, the CHIPS Act, I won't go through what each of these acts was, but put aside $1 billion for carbon removal research. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act put aside $8 billion for 4 direct air capture hubs, for storage, validation and testing of direct air capture technology, for transport of capture and carbon dioxide, plus additional money for direct air capture kind of prize schemes, utilisation research, etc. And the Inflation Reduction Act amended the Section 45Q tax credits, which in the United States give rewards for carbon capture and utilisation. And this is a bottomless pit of money where they're offering $180 per tonne, which is now front-loaded for companies that perform direct air capture, and $130 per tonne for direct air capture and usage. Now, the predominant usage of captured carbon today is in enhanced oil and gas recovery. So there's a lot of reasons not to be wildly enthusiastic about some of those initiatives, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the effort that the Biden administration is putting into developing technology in this area. Now, at one level, I look at that and think it's nuts, because it's much cheaper to capture carbon at the smokestack and then to sequester or utilise it than direct air capture is. So putting this amount, so basically it makes no economic sense to do large-scale direct air capture until you have done carbon and capture and storage at every smokestack. So at one level, I find it a little bit inexplicable that the United States is working so hard on being the leader in this technology, but it does suggest that they are seriously thinking about what reaching net zero emissions means, because if you've kind of captured all of the low-hanging fruit in mitigation, then you will need to look at large-scale carbon drawdown in order to get to net zero or better net negative emissions. So I think it's useful that they're doing this research, even though for me it's a bit of a head-scratcher at this point. I'll move on to exploration of reflecting sunlight. For me, there's a puzzle. Most people's gut reaction when they hear about the idea of intentionally reflecting some of the sun's energy into space in order to offset or to minimise the impacts of climate change, most people are horrified or repulsed by that idea of a global, deliberate intervention in global climate systems. There's an ick factor to that. I think paraphrase Naomi Klein when she said, the idea that we should fix the crud that we put into the atmosphere by putting more crud into the atmosphere appalls most people. So it's hard for me to imagine how this could be implemented. But if you look at projections for future climate change, and you see that very likely we're looking at more than 3 degrees of warming before 2100, Well, if you look at the destruction that we're seeing, the fires, floods, extreme weather event, rising sea levels, etc., at 1.5 degrees of warming, and we're doing, we're on a track, we're going towards way more than that. Well, I also can't imagine how we get to 2100 without implementing solar geoengineering. So for me, there's a puzzle there, and I can't begin to tell you how those things interact. But what we can see is that in the last decade, many major states or political units, the European Union, China, United States, etc., have conducted research asking what would be the implications of solar geoengineering for their national economies, their agricultural sector, in some cases the ecosystem impacts, etc. So there has been serious thinking around the world about this topic. And as recently as June, the European Commission was pushing for global negotiations concerning the governance of solar geoengineering and solar geoengineering research. As I mentioned earlier, in 2021, the National Academies of Science in the United States produced a Reflecting Sunlight report on solar geoengineering, which urged the US government to undertake strategic research into its technical feasibility and effectiveness. And in 2022, US Congress, with some Republican support, complied, commissioning a 5-year study which is now being undertaken by the White House Office of Science and Technology. I'm not suggesting that this is remotely a high priority for the United States. But it is something which is slowly growing the research is slowly advancing around the world. The strategic thinking about it is developing slowly. Although Australia's done very little to think about it, one area, so basically there've been no large outdoor experiments into solar geoengineering, but the thing that's closest to it is trials that have been conducted above the Great Barrier Reef into cloud brightening, to see if during coral bleaching incidents, I won't go into the approach, but basically thickening the cloud cover during ocean heat waves might protect the Great Barrier Reef from coral bleaching. The resistance from people who are very critical of solar geoengineering to that has been minimal, and I suspect that is because of the very obvious, so there's been support from the local Indigenous owners and also the very obvious benefits for the Great Barrier Reef if this intervention were to turn out to be successful. Now that's quite a different thing from global scale solar geoengineering, but it's the one area where I guess Australia has been participating in this topic. The Climate Overshoot Commission suggested that there should be an immediate moratorium on deployment and large-scale experiments in order to build confidence. But it also urged something equivalent to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an ongoing multilateral effort to report on the science of solar geoengineering. So it's not just a few scientists in North America and Europe working on this, but something where the global south is fully informed. And they also called for the beginning of international deliberation over what kind of governance mechanisms might be utilised were the international community to go down this path. One of the obvious concerns with solar geoengineering is the way it would be implemented most likely would be with a fleet of aeroplanes permanently flying in the stratosphere at multiple latitudes. And you can imagine, if the United States or China went ahead with that without the support of the other, that would be a strategically, I'll say, complex situation. So clearly this is an area where it would be catastrophic to proceed without very careful work on it being a multilateral and cooperatively governed initiative. Now, these two exotic topics that I've covered as I wind up are not at all a central focus at COP28. As I mentioned at the beginning, the global stocktake, which we in Australia will focus on in terms of its implications for the development of our new nationally determined contributions in 2025, and north-south conflicts such as that over the loss and damages mechanism, where the West at COP27 somewhat cynically agreed to the creation of such a mechanism, but no promises except a few tens of millions of dollars from European countries to fund it. And so there's now contestation: who will control these funds? Will it be the World Bank? Will it be some body within the United Nations, which obviously would be the preference of the Global South, because then it would be more democratically controlled? Who will fund this loss and damage mechanism? Will the West honour the finance commitments it has previously made around adaptation and mitigation issues? These will be the issues that preoccupy countries from the Global South, even if they are not the focus of our attention here in Australia. So I'll wind up on that note, and any questions?
Right on the dot, 7. We now have precisely 30 minutes for questions and discussion. Please wait for the intern. Daniel's armed with a microphone and will shortly approach Richard.
Thank you. What an interesting and complicated talk you've just given us. I'm very impressed because it's mainly without notes. Very much is in your head. My question relates to
Printer broke.
a possible compromise between gathering electricity through solar cells and then blocking the sun from providing the sunlight to drive those solar cells. Surely there'd have to be some complex gavotte internationally to work out which areas of the Earth could be open for solar energy and which have to be blocked to try and stop global warming.
Sure. So a bit of a backstory of solar geoengineering. The idea was first brought to public attention. It's got a much older history in Soviet science, but it was first brought to public attention by Paul Crutzen, an atmospheric chemist who also brought the problem of ozone layer depletion to global attention. And Crutzen, in the article, I think, I could get my year wrong, but I think 2003, where he sort of blew the whistle saying it's time to start talking about this, pointed out that we already, at the same time as we have global warming, we also have a global dimming phenomenon, where the particulate pollution from industry, most of it gets into our lungs or local air, but a little bit of it gets up into the stratosphere, where it is already cooling the planet by somewhere in the vicinity of 1/2 degree. And Crutzen said we need to clean this up because of its extreme impacts on human health and local environment. But as we clean it, as in if we stop that pollution today, and a little bit of the recent acceleration of warming is probably on account of lower pollution levels, meaning that the global dimming phenomenon is a bit lower than it was previously. So Crutzen's argument was, let's stop unintentionally geoengineering and start, well, he didn't say we should do it, we should research the possibility of intentionally putting that particulate matter back there. Now, the quantum of reflection that we're talking about, you're right that it would have a little bit of an impact on crop yields, little changes in crop productivity in different places, and a very small impact on the productivity of solar panels, but not as big as as in the dust that forms on solar panels does the same thing. So not as big a factor as your cleaning kind of roster. Does that make sense? So it's a marginal, can't give you a number, but it's a couple of percentage of solar panels, well, as in it's probably around 1% or something of solar productivity. So it's a factor, but not a giant factor. And one more thing I should probably say is that there would be an effort. So I'm not a scientist, but in order for solar geoengineering to cause each region of the planet to return as close as possible to a pre-industrial temperature and rainfall pattern, you would need to have a careful application of it across basically the entire Earth. A little bit thicker, and there's a tendency for it to cool the equator more than the poles, so you'd adjust for that. But I think that the decision making would be guided by the kind of returning to a pre-industrial climate goal rather than by maximising solar panel productivity in Sydney goal. Yeah.
Next question, John.
Oh, right, thanks. Not sure whether this is an entirely appropriate question or not, but Paul Crutzon's name was mentioned, and particulate matter in the upper stratosphere has been mentioned. I remember a cartoon that circulated some years ago saying, "Oh, I'm not worried about global warming. I think it's going to be obviated by nuclear winter." The ultimate particulate matter in the upper atmosphere solution to global warming.
Not sure there's a question there.
But I do invite comment.
I don't really have comment. I mean, there's a variety of phenomena in which you could have runaway climate change in warming or a cooling direction. I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not well equipped to comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Crutzen was on one of the panels that wrote one of the many papers on nuclear winter.
Yeah.
You're next.
Greatly enjoyed your talk. Very clear and some very nice projections. I get a whiff of Lomberg in this geoengineering. I mean, to me, the fault line in Lomberg was that he doesn't talk about tipping points. He just says it's a straight line increase. And there's a bit of this in what you're talking about, that, okay, we get a gradual increase and that's okay, and we can maybe do it by geoengineering. But really, the low-hanging fruit is enormous still. And I can remember George Bush ringing this technology bill decades ago as a way of avoiding multilateral agreements on climate change. And I'm deeply suspicious of the Americans and their wonderful idea that technology is going to solve everything. But is it not the low-hanging fruit, really? We've got and it's huge, let's face it. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in Australia, which our government is pushing up against. This clean energy, which is really muddying the low-hanging fruit thing, yeah.
There's a lot to respond to there. The whiff of Lomberg, I agree with, as in, I guess all that I have been suggesting today is that this is a topic which will gain prominence as the severity of climate change worsens. Given that carbon dioxide is a stock pollutant, we, in any realistic scenario, have many, many decades of overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees of warming ahead of us. What I mean by that is, the low-hanging fruit, there's a lot of it, but most of the low-hanging fruit, there are real political reasons why it's hard to capture. Australia's pink bat scheme is a win-win-win-win-win, but politically catastrophic. And all kinds of other low-hanging fruit, there's a similar reason why they look like low-hanging fruit, but they're kind of hard to capture. But let's say we could capture all of the low-hanging fruit, and let's say the globe halved greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Well, I mean, that's we would be on a much better trajectory, but still, that would mean that climate change was still getting worse at a slower pace than it is in our current trajectory. Like the fire season that we had was 4 years ago. We're going to have more of them, as we very likely in the next couple of years, but they'll be getting worse and worse. So until we reach net zero, emissions reductions slow the pace at which the problem gets worse, and up till now, global greenhouse gas emissions, except for the COVID wobble, have just been steadily increasing at a slower level than before. Maybe they'll peak in the next few years, but they haven't peaked yet. So the question that the Overshoot Commission is asking is I think 2 degrees warming is now inevitable. For people like me, I'm well insulated from climate harms. But for the most vulnerable people, those climate harms are really significant already today. So as we capture those low-hanging fruit, as the Overshoot Commission says, we should definitely prioritise mitigation and getting to net negative. That's our number one priority. But Will the international community also end up asking questions about solar geoengineering? I think it will, and I think it would be smart for Australia to be investigating that possibility. On the ethical questions, I guess the one clear argument that I would make is that although there is strong opposition to thinking about deliberate interventions among the kind of green left in the West, I think this decision should not be driven by either the Pentagon, the PLA, the German Greens. It should be driven by and I know this is a political impossibility, but the voice of the most vulnerable people needs to be an important one in this global decision making.
Thank you for the talk. It was very good. I agree with you absolutely. We're on the way to 2 degrees and on the way past it quite possibly. And I agree with you that we're going to have to be looking at non-organic, methods of geoengineering and climate change. So what's the activity in Australia? Is there an Australian equivalent of the Overshoot Commission? Who are the people that are acting on these issues in Australia, other than yourself? It seems to, I'm aware of some efforts by Geoscience Australia and CSIRO with ultramafic rocks trying to look at it for capture and things like that. But is there any sort of coordination that is going on your two end topics?
No. So on the solar geoengineering, there's a centre in UTAS, University of Tasmania, for the study of climate interventions, and there's a couple of climate modellers who are involved in the global scientific effort. But politically, one of the points that I make is Australia is weird for not having conducted a national level assessment of solar geoengineering. On carbon removal, it's a much more complicated picture. There was a CSIRO report at the end of last year, which on Australian carbon sequestration potential. I would be shocked if the federal government does not respond to that. And obviously we have our soil carbon scheme. I like your facial response there. Yeah. And then we have there's a huge scientific expertise which I don't have a map of, but there are all kinds of and I'm sure there are also some companies working on this. I don't know the scene well, but basically in carbon storage, there's a lot of work here, and I don't think it's the natural solution space is politically quite popular. The inorganic carbon storage space, less politically popular, but there's a huge amount of scientific research, and I would assume, I haven't tried to map what mining companies are doing, but I would be shocked if there were not also work there. I mean, I'm going to go back to the Lombok point. Sometimes figures on the right use quite reasonable arguments as fig leaves for climate inaction. So Barack Obama created a thing called Mission Innovation in 2016, which was a global effort to double expenditure on low carbon research and development. He barely spoke about it because it's not a political winner, but it's had real impacts on the amount of research. So as in, it's a Bjorn Lomborg, George Bush style focus on accelerating the pace of innovation, which there is no question. There are all kinds of areas where decarbonisation is difficult or impossible with today's technologies, where we need to do research. But when George Bush or Bjorn Lomborg make that argument, I am very suspicious that they are really, and the same thing has happened with clean coal. And so again, clean coal involves a carbon capture technology, which if we are to do, and I'm really sceptical of carbon removal, but I think we need to explore it, but I'm sceptical that we'll ever do it at scale. But if we do it at scale, the stepping stone to that is technology, probably more like clean gas. Gas with carbon capture is more likely a stepping stone to it, but the political, the Bjorn Lomborg effect, if we can call, I'm probably committing slander here, I hope I'm not, but the people using credible arguments as fig leaves for inaction is a problem because those same technologies get a kind of taint around them as a consequence of that. I'll say one more mischievous thing, which is I think there is a very credible argument to be exploring nuclear power. However, when our opposition leader says that, after, was it a decade, I don't know how long the previous government was in power, but they had a long time in power where if they thought that if nuclear power was a response to climate change, they could have implemented it. So I think there's another element of disingenuousness in some of the positions that particular political actors take. But it doesn't mean, just because my enemy is arguing for something, it doesn't mean that there might not be some merit to the thing that they're pushing for.
Words of comfort.
Maybe.
Who'd like to
Thank you. One of the things, there are so many issues that you raised that I'd like to raise with you, but I'll start by asking about, I remember reading about 15 years ago about geoengineering. I'm not quite sure how that was to be manufactured or set in place, but I gathered that at the time, strategically, it was advanced by the USA, and I will get to a question, with the reflection into space. What concerns me when you say about that Europe is getting into it, America is getting into it, is about the global south, because a lot of commitment has been made in the past by the global north to assist the global south in the reduction of emissions, and they haven't delivered on that. So what chance do you see of there being some sort of balance between the global north and the global south, and so that the global north and are not advantageously benefiting from carbon reduction while the global south suffers?
Right. So in terms of solar geoengineering, I just want to clarify. Overwhelmingly, Europe is seeking to regulate it, worrying that someone else might do it. So Europe has studied its impacts, but sentiment in Europe at the moment, I think, is, well, publicly expressed sentiment is opposed. In the United States, the situation is less clear. It's clearly not something that the Biden administration wants to talk about very much. But it is something that the US is seeking to have, I guess, and it's hard from this distance, especially given how little is said publicly about it. It's very hard to know whether Biden's even heard of it, at what level it sits in their decision making. I'm sure Biden has heard about it at some point, because in fact, when the Soviet Union looked, I don't know whether it's the 50s or the 60s, looked at the problem of climate change, they said, this is happening, and solar geoengineering is the solution. When the first report to a US president of climate change was made, the same argument was, clearly, greenhouse gas emissions are going to continue, this is the solution. So it's been around for a long, long time in elite scientific circles. There is, I guess for me, a note of hope, because I agree with you that, like most things, it would very likely be dominated by the great powers. And that's unfortunate, given that people of the South are the primary victims of climate change. There's a thing, I always forget whether it's been called Decimals Fund and the Degrees Initiative at different points, but if you Google either Decimals Fund or Degrees Initiative, you'll find it. It's a NGO which is giving grants to scientists across the global South to do national research on solar geoengineering, exploring what the implications for that country would be, working with, it tends to be climate scientists using the modelling tools to ask this question. And in my mind, before the international community can talk about this usefully, that research, not just asking what are the implications for US and Europe, but and China and India have both conducted national assessments, and through decimals/degrees funding, countries such as Indonesia, Kenya, I think, like a number of other countries around the global south have also conducted their own national assessments, which means when this comes up, there will be a better evidence base for those countries. I guess one of the things to worry about with solar geoengineering is if you've masked, so let's say by the end of this century, we would have had 3 degrees of warming, but we've masked 1.5 degrees with solar geoengineering. If it was suddenly terminated, then the climate would bounce back within just a couple of years to that 3-degree mark. And the harms associated with slow warming, to which people and to a degree ecosystems might adapt, are much greater than the harms associated with that really rapid warming. So that risk of sudden termination and a termination effect is a major thing to worry about. I guess for a concern for the global south, the geopolitics right now means that the United States is not, I would argue, going to implement this without major countries of the south, such as India and China, agreeing to it. And they're not a perfect proxy for the interests of the south, but I don't know, they're a better proxy than the Pentagon and Brussels. So you would need a significant level of global agreement to begin to implement this, which is one reason why I said I can't imagine how it happens, but I also can't imagine how it doesn't happen.
Thank you. Right up there.
Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate the talk. I'm just following on from that other question. I'm curious about how this interacts with loss and damage discussions that are going on internationally.
It doesn't really, because this is still kooky fringe stuff, and in fact, well, it's more something that I don't know, academics and climate scientists are interested in rather than state leaders in the South, for the obvious reason that they have much more immediate pressing concerns to think about. And it's inconvenient. So if, like, the Bjorn Lomborg type argument, as in an economic kind of, someone who has no values besides economics might say, you can implement this for $10 or $15 billion a year, wouldn't have to worry about any other mitigation efforts, you'd remove a significant proportion of climate harms, why wouldn't you do it? And it's surprising to me that extreme right-wing think tanks aren't putting more effort into pushing exactly. There is a bit of right-wing think tank initiative in that area, but it would seem as though it could be a bigger priority for them than it is. But that set of arguments would be unwelcome, I guess, at the moment by the Global South, because they're wanting, since the 1970s, the central demand of countries in the South in global environmental negotiations has been international technology transfer and international assistance to pay for the costs of adaptation and mitigation of this. And it wasn't in the 70s, it wasn't climate we were talking about, but there has been the G77, like basically the same concepts have been echoing for, they're the legacy of the new international economic order, appears in contemporary climate debates on topics such as loss and damage, international financing, the various green funds that have been set up. So there's not a intersection, but to the degree that anyone's thinking about it, they're kind of wanting to keep it out of the conversation, I would assume.
We have time for a couple more questions. Can you? I was going to go the other way, but
Sorry. So, Mark Andreessen, techno-optimism, I don't know if you've come across his manifesto yet, but the enemy was the precautionary principle. And it's quite right to identify that, because that's one of the things that is going to face these sort of mitigation technologies or reflectant technologies. And it's that contrast between the people that have been concerned about the environment now have to accept some technology to change the environment. And do you see any way to help them come to that?
Maybe. Well, I guess I would. one of the most mischievous things that I like to say about the Green movement is it came into existence opposing hydroelectricity, as in the Green parties around the world, came into existence opposing hydroelectricity and nuclear power, which even today are the world's number one and number two sources of near zero carbon electricity. So there's something maladapted about the thinking, across the political spectrum. I've just used that as an example, which I think speaks to your point, which might annoy some people. But there is something maladaptive about all of the political ideologies which emerged during the Holocene, the period when humans were not the primary driver of changes in the Earth's systems, and the contemporary political or our contemporary ecological situation. I'm working politics and political theory. All of the theories and the political scientists work on basically emerged during an era where the routine operation of business as usual did not cause global ecological catastrophe. And now we need to understand, which your question points to, that business as usual causes that. I point to another kind of mental tick that we have. Unintentional interference in complex systems we treat very differently from intentional interference in complex systems. At the moment, we are unintentionally geoengineering, and no one, as in and also we are unintentionally causing climate change, a massive transformation of climate systems. But when we speak about an intentional interference, we have this, most of us, a kind of gut, moral kind of reflux of opposing that. And so I guess a moral argument that I would make is that it should be the victims of climate change who make these decisions. And I know that's a political impossibility, but if we can find governance mechanisms where the victims of climate change make the decisions, then I think that deals with some of that embedded precautionary principle issue that you speak of. I also think there's generational change going on. The generation which has been raised, often going to climate protests even before they understood the issue in great detail. And in some cases, the projections for this century for climate change are terrible, but they do not, in the mainstream, as in there are some fringe scenarios, but probably we do not render the Earth uninhabitable this century. Things get more difficult, but not catastrophic for humans in this century. Now, a lot of young people have a sense that the situation is much more dire than that, and it means that there are shifts going on. I see this when I'm teaching students. Some of the attitudes, so the generation of environmentalists that raised me, some of their ideas just make no sense to my students. And you can also, in this country, there's a group called the Darebin Environmental Action Group. Darebin is a suburb of Melbourne that probably people in Sydney haven't heard of, but they were one of the first to demand that local government declare a climate emergency. And they also have really interesting language around geoengineering and the idea of they use the language of safe passage during the period of overshoot. I can't remember what their language is here, but during the period of overshoot beyond safe or outside of a safe climate. Now, I'm not saying that's mainstream. Obviously, most of the Green left is vehemently opposed to the more technological approaches that I've been discussing today. But I think that slowly, political ideas are changing in this area.
For our last question, we come not to John, but to the lady behind. No.
Oh, not me. Someone.
No, it was you. You had your hand up before.
Yeah. Well, it's a sort. As a sort of a basic person, when we're running out of water, if the government appeals to everyone, can you use less? Why isn't the world asking people, why don't we all use less energy? I never hear it. I mean, surely if people, the individuals, is this just a ridiculous thought, but why don't people use less energy?
Firstly, you're right that energy efficiency and I guess frugality is
Yes.
there are all kinds of areas where we could reduce energy. In some parts of the world, such as Japan after the oil shocks of the 1970s, massive efforts in exactly this area, but that has tended to be in response to energy shortages rather than environmental concern.
And it doesn't help.
Sorry?
It doesn't help.
It doesn't help?
Does it help?
Oh, does it help? Well, it does help. I guess for me there are two problems. One is, yes, theoretically it's a really important area. In this country we have all kinds of buildings that are very poorly insulated, and there's some really obvious low-hanging fruit which in any scenario you need to do. But there are two things to keep in mind. One is the politics of it.
Yes.
You look at how we voted against the carbon price, which was revenue net negative. It gave back more money to the community, but it was so easy to raise opposition to any price signal that the public feels. And the main way in which we promote energy efficiency at the moment is through price signals. And there's huge opposition to that. There's even opposition to car fuel standards, the way we might destroy the weekend if you can't have a ute, all those kinds of ideas. So there's political opposition. And then the second thing is, since carbon dioxide is a stock pollutant, halving our electricity use would once again halve the pace at which we're making the problem worse. Ultimately, we need to have a zero carbon energy supply. Now, if we've got energy efficiency, where our energy use is reduced, then it's easier to have a zero carbon energy supply. So I'm not arguing against you. But ultimately, in addition to individual behaviour change, we also need collective investments in the technologies that will enable people to live whatever lives they're demanding in a zero carbon way, and that is necessarily a collective social challenge. Individual contribution can make some difference, but it also has to be technological transformation, whether it's wind and solar, nuclear, carbon capture plus gas, or whatever technology suite people recommend. Ultimately, we need to get to net zero energy sources.
Thank you, John.
Can I just say a word there? I think we are using less energy. Sorry.
We are on a per capita basis, yeah.
On a per capita base or production basis of what we're producing. We are using less energy to get it, but of course we're producing more.
Yeah.
So the effect is lost.
I think per capita energy usage, I'm not 100% sure of my facts, but I'm pretty confident per capita energy usage in Australia and many other, it's mostly about deindustrialising, I think.
Yes, industrialising,
yeah.
So it's going down.
Yeah, so in many places we have less industrial production, and I'm sure also there's all kinds of energy efficiency measures which is combined. Used to be that energy demand increased really constantly. It's been flatlining in most places, which is one of the reasons why building new... So in China, they've got the world's biggest wind, solar and nuclear construction programs going on because they've got rapidly rising energy demand. But in most of the West, we've got flatlining or slowly decreasing energy demand, which has meant that the kind of business case for any new energy infrastructure is much weaker than it is in rapidly growing, industrialising parts of the world.
And nuclear is not economic.
Thank you for the last word.
Thank you, John, for your words. Very much appreciated. We're coming towards the end of our program here. Next week we'll be holding the Institute's annual general meeting, to which our paid-up members are very welcome. The following week we'll be putting out the last edition of Columns from Glover Cottages for the year, and it's going to take a look at the year that's gone and the major issues that have arisen, so that'll be a pretty rich field. On Tuesday the 14th we have our next speaking event when eminent University of Sydney Thailand expert Dr. Aim Sing Peng will once again address us. She was last here in 2017, and she'll be talking to us about the situation of politics in Thailand. But to round off our event this evening, it's time for our vote of thanks to be given by one of our interns, Matt Buzic.
First of all, thank you, Jonathan, so much for this great presentation. And I think as a member of Generation Z, the issue of climate change is more important than ever. Of course, we've had famous figures like Greta Thunberg speak out for climate change, and it's very important today, especially considering that island nations such as Tuvalu and the Maldives' existence are very much threatened, and recent climate change disasters like the catastrophic floods in Daraa, Libya, as well as the fires in the Canary Islands in Spain and Greece, occurring a lot more, these catastrophes are. So your presentation is very much incredibly important in today's stage. I'd like to move a vote of thanks by mode of applause, so thank you very much.